Go find a banana. Seriously, go look in your kitchen. Chances are there's one sitting on your counter right now. It's the first solid food for a lot of babies. It's the pre-workout snack for millions of athletes. And it's the perfect, easy, grab-and-go breakfast. It is, without a doubt, the most popular fruit in the world. It's consistent, predictable, and it's always, always cheap. A miracle of modern logistics, delivered perfectly yellow to every corner of the planet. But here's the thing, that banana on your counter, it's a complete and total fraud. It's a sterile mutant, a biological impossibility that can't reproduce on its own. It has no seeds. In fact, every single banana you've ever eaten, every banana in every grocery store on the planet, is a clone. The exact same plant, just copied and pasted over and over and over again. And that creates a problem. A massive, terrifying problem. It means the entire species is balanced on a knife's edge, one single disease away from being completely wiped off the face of the earth. Again. So how is this possible? How did a fruit that technically shouldn't exist, a fragile clone teetering on the abyss of extinction, become the cheapest and most consumed fruit in the world? How did a biological ghost take over the planet? Well, that story is bizarre, and it's brutal. It involves corporate spies, secret wars, and a complete re-engineering of nature itself. So grab a banana if you still have an appetite, because this is the story of how we created the perfect fruit and how it's about to disappear forever. Now, when I say that the banana on your counter is a clone, I want you to understand that I'm not being metaphorical. And when I say every banana you've ever eaten is the same, that's not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. The truth is, there are over 1,000 different kinds of bananas in the world. They come in all shapes, sizes, and colors. There are red bananas, blue bananas, short and fat bananas that taste like strawberries. Most of them are packed with seeds, like they're supposed to be, but you've probably never seen one. Because the global banana trade, the one that stocks every supermarket from Omaha to Oslo, isn't interested in 1,000 different bananas. It's interested in exactly one. It's called the Cavendish. And of the roughly 100 billion bananas eaten annually around the world, the Cavendish accounts for pretty much all of the ones that get put on a container ship. Around 99% of the export market, and something like half of all bananas grown on the entire planet. It is a monoculture on a scale that is honestly difficult to process. It means that every single banana in our global system is genetically identical. Not similar. Identical. So why this one? Out of 1,000 varieties, why did we bet the entire farm on the Cavendish? Is it the most delicious? The most nutritious? Of course not. The reason is much more boring and much more cynical. The Cavendish was chosen because it's dependable. Its thick skin makes it resistant to bruising. It can be picked green in massive quantities, shipped thousands of miles, and then gassed with ethylene in a ripening room so it turns a perfect uniform yellow just a few hours before it hits your grocery store shelf. It's not a fruit, it's a product, engineered for logistics. And that brings us back to that terrifying problem I mentioned. When you build an entire global food supply on a single set of genes, you've created a system that is incredibly, fantastically fragile. One single blight, one fungus, one disease that figures out how to kill the Cavendish, and it's game over. All of it. Gone. And this isn't some far-fetched hypothetical threat. It's a reality, because it has happened before. Alright, so to understand how an entire species could get wiped out, you first have to get your head around something fundamental. You have to understand what a modern banana actually is, and more importantly, what it isn't. We think of the banana as the ultimate health food, the perfect symbol of nature. It's not processed, it's not full of chemicals, it literally comes in its own biodegradable wrapper. We give it to our babies as their first solid food, precisely because we see it as pure, untouched. But that's a complete fantasy. The truth is, the banana on your counter is one of the most unnatural things you can possibly eat. It's a freak, a biological mistake that we captured, froze in time, and then forced into mass production. Here's the thing. Wild bananas, the original bananas that still grow in Southeast Asia, are practically inedible. They're small, and they are absolutely crammed with seeds. Not the tiny, soft black specks you see in your Cavendish. We're talking big, hard, pebble-like seeds that would crack your teeth. There's barely any actual fruit to eat. So how did we get from that to the sweet, seedless fruit we have today? Well, it was a 1 in a billion genetic accident. Thousands of years ago, 2 different species of these seedy, wild bananas cross-pollinated, and their offspring was a weird, sterile hybrid. This new plant was a biological dead end, but it had a mutation that made it incredible. It was bigger, sweeter, and had almost no seeds. It was basically a botanical mule. You know how a horse and a donkey can reproduce, but their offspring, the mule, is sterile. It's strong, it's useful, but it's the end of the line. It can't have babies. Well, that's our banana, a genetic impossibility that can't reproduce on its own. Which raises a pretty obvious question. If it can't make seeds, how in the world do we have billions of them? Well, we clone it. And I mean that literally. To make a new banana plant, farmers don't plant a seed. They walk up to an existing banana tree, cut off a part of its underground stem called a corm, and they plant that piece in the ground. The new plant that grows isn't a child of the original. It's a genetically identical copy, a Xerox. Every Cavendish banana in existence is just a cutting of a cutting of a cutting, going back in an unbroken line to that one original mutant plant from thousands of years ago. It's not farming, it's horticulture on an insane global scale. And this artificial, man-made system created the perfect product, dependable, identical, easy to ship. It worked beautifully. Until one day, it didn't. Because before our banana, the Cavendish, there was another one. Another perfect, seedless, sterile clone that dominated the world. Its name was the Gros Michel, and its story is a terrifying preview of what's about to happen to ours. So where did it happen? Where did humanity first capture this botanical lightning in a bottle? This 1 in a billion genetic mistake we now call a banana? To answer that, we have to go back. Way back. Not to the 1950s or the 1850s, but all the way back to around 5000 BC. We're talking 7,000 years ago, to a place called the Cook Swamp in the highlands of what is now Papua New Guinea. Now, this isn't some story about grand empires or conquering kings. This is one of the very first places on the entire planet where human beings stopped wandering and started farming. And archaeologists digging in the ancient mud have found that alongside staples like taro and yams, these early farmers were tending to the wild ancestors of our modern banana. And I want you to remember what these plants were. As we said, they were basically inedible, small, tough, and just absolutely packed with hard, stony seeds. You would sooner crack a tooth than get a decent meal out of one. So the question that puzzled scientists for decades was pretty simple. Why on earth would anyone bother trying to cultivate them? The answer, it turns out, is staggering. For a long time, the evidence was buried, but then archaeologists at Cook Swamp found microscopic, fossilized plant cells in the soil. They're called phytoliths, basically tiny silica ghosts of leaves and fruit, preserved for millennia. And these ghosts told an unbelievable story. They proved that people here weren't just gathering wild bananas. They were actively farming them. And here's the crazy part. They weren't just planting any old seedy banana. The evidence shows they were specifically seeking out and selecting the freaks. The rare, naturally occurring sterile hybrids, the botanical mules, the ones that, by sheer genetic luck, were a little bigger, a little sweeter, and had fewer seeds. Which means that these ancient farmers, 7,000 years ago, had figured out the secret. They realized these special bananas couldn't reproduce by seed. It was a dead end. But they also realized you could get around that. You could clone them. That's right. With no writing, no laboratories, just thousands of hours of observation, they figured out that if they dug up the underground stem of one of these amazing mutant plants, cut it into pieces, and replanted those pieces, they would get a perfect, identical copy. They invented horticultural cloning before the wheel had even reached most of the world. This wasn't just farming. This was the beginning of a profound and artificial relationship between humans and this one particular fruit. It was the moment we took a genetic accident and turned it into a technology. And for thousands of years, this incredible knowledge would spread slowly, from island to island, creating hundreds of different local beloved varieties. But the banana hadn't taken over the world yet. For that to happen, one of these perfect, sterile, man-made clones had to go global. It needed to be so good, so productive, and so dependable that it could build an entire industry around itself. And that brings us, at last, to the Gros Michel, Big Mike, the undisputed king of all bananas and the ghost that haunts our produce aisle to this very day. Okay, so these ancient farmers in New Guinea have cracked the code. They can clone bananas. With nothing more than a sharp stone and a deep understanding of the plant, they've found the agricultural equivalent of a save point. The ability to find one perfect freak of nature plant and copy it forever. And so, this incredible technology and the cloned plants themselves began to spread. Slowly, painfully slowly. It was carried by Austronesian sailors on their incredible voyages across the Pacific, moving from island to island, eventually making its way across the Indian Ocean to Madagascar, and from there into the African continent. Everywhere this cloned banana went, it was a revolution, a new, reliable food source. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Because as different cultures adopted it, they didn't all want the same thing. And what happened next was a great divergence, a fork in the road that split the banana's destiny in two. And this is the single most important split in the entire history of the banana. On one path, people looked at this new plant and saw a source of calories. They didn't care about sweetness. They needed starch. They needed a dense, reliable carbohydrate they could boil, fry, or mash. A crop that could do the job of a potato or a yam. So they selected the clones that were big, starchy, and held up to cooking. It wasn't a dessert. It was dinner. These are the plantains. And for hundreds of millions of people across Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America, this is what a banana is. They are the backbone of entire cuisines, a staple food that people depend on for survival. But they are a local story. They don't get packed on container ships. They aren't part of the global system we've been talking about. For that, we have to look down the other path at the fork, the path of sweetness. By sheer luck, and through more genetic accidents and careful selection in different regions, another type of banana began to emerge. A banana that was smaller, softer, and incredibly sweet when ripe. This wasn't a staple. It was a luxury, a treat. And while the starchy plantain became a quiet, dependable cornerstone of tropical diets, it's that other path, the sweet, delicate, accidental one, that would lead to unimaginable wealth, corporate warfare, and a single banana variety that would completely conquer the planet before being wiped off the face of it, the path that leads us directly to the Banana King, the one they called the Gros Michel. Alright, so let's get our bearings. That sweet dessert banana, the one that took the other fork in the road back in Southeast Asia, has started its journey. It's followed those incredible Austronesian sailors on their voyages, hopping from island to island across the Indian Ocean until it finally makes landfall in Madagascar and along the coast of East Africa. But I want you to be clear on a point. At this stage, this isn't a global fruit. It's not even a regional one. It's a local delicacy, a sweet, strange little treat you might find in a handful of port towns. It hasn't conquered anything yet. So how does it break out? How does it make the jump from a village on the Swahili coast to, well, everywhere else? For that, we need to bring in another group of master traders, the people who were connecting the entire known world at the time. the Arabs. Just like with sugar, Arab merchants were building a trading empire that stretched from Spain to Indonesia. And when they came across this weird new fruit, they immediately saw its potential. And this is the moment where our fruit finally gets its name. Literally. Because when these traders first saw the small yellow bananas being sold in the markets, they noticed they were grown and sold in clusters that looked an awful lot like a human hand. And each individual fruit, a finger. The Arabic word for fingertip is banan, and that name stuck. From there, the plant and its name spread like wildfire. Arab traders carried the banana corms west along their vast network, through the Middle East and across North Africa. And then, in the 15th century, Portuguese explorers pushing down the coast of West Africa run into it, adopt the name, and start planting it in their new offshore colonies, the Canary Islands. And from the Canary Islands, it's just one short, fateful hop across the Atlantic. In the early 1500s, Spanish missionaries bring the first banana plants to the Caribbean, hoping to cultivate a cheap, easy source of calories for their new estates. They had absolutely no idea what they were about to unleash, because a few decades later, on a plantation in Jamaica, one of those plants would undergo a random, miraculous mutation. It became a new banana, a banana so big, so sweet, and so incredibly perfect for shipping that it would change everything. A banana that would build an empire before being completely wiped off the face of the earth. The king of all bananas, the Gros Michel. Okay, I want to back up for a second because we just blew past a hugely important detail in that last section, and it's something I really need you to focus on. The Portuguese planting bananas in the Canary Islands. That sounds innocent enough, right? Just some explorers bringing a new plant to a new place. But this wasn't some casual, friendly act of horticulture. This was the beginning of something new and terrifying. It was the invention of a system. A cold, calculating machine built for one purpose, turning a tropical fruit into an industrial-scale commodity. And if that sounds familiar, it should. Because the Portuguese had just done the exact same thing a few hundred kilometers to the north, on the island of Madeira. We talked about it in our story on sugar. They took an island, cleared it, and used slave labor to build the world's first factory-style sugar plantations. A model so brutal and so profitable that it would change the world forever. Well, in the Canaries, they ran the exact same playbook, only this time with bananas. Now, these islands weren't empty. They were inhabited by an indigenous people, the Guanche. But the Spanish and Portuguese colonists who arrived didn't see a culture or a civilization. They saw an obstacle, and then a labor force. Over the course of a century, the Guanche were systematically hunted, enslaved, and worked to death on the new plantations, until they were completely gone. Wiped out. It was a genocide in miniature, and it was all in service of this new model. Step 1. Seize an island. Step 2. Eradicate or enslave the local population. Step 3. Clear-cut the native ecosystem and replant it with a single, profitable cash crop. Step 4. Ship that product back to Europe for staggering profits. This was the dark rehearsal, the dress rehearsal for the Americas. On these small islands in the Atlantic, European powers were perfecting a blueprint for colonial agriculture. A brutal, repeatable formula for extracting wealth from land by destroying both it and its people. They had built the engine of exploitation. All they were missing was the perfect fuel to make it run on a global scale. And as we know, that fuel, that 1 in a million mutant banana, was about to appear on a plantation in Jamaica, the Gros Michel. And when you plug the perfect fruit into a perfect system of exploitation, you don't just get a business. You get an empire, and a century of unimaginable bloodshed. All right, so the board is set. On one side, we have the perfect fruit, the Gros Michel, bigger, sweeter, and more resilient than any banana that had come before. On the other, we have that brutal machine for colonial agriculture, perfected in the sugar trade and ready to be deployed on a massive scale. So you'd think the story just explodes from here, right? That the minute the Gros Michel appears, banana empires start popping up all over the Caribbean. But it didn't. Not even close. For all its potential, the banana had one massive, fatal flaw that made it almost impossible to turn into a global business. It rots. And I don't mean it rots like an apple getting a soft spot. I mean it rots with a vengeance. The moment it's picked, a biochemical clock starts ticking, and there is no snooze button. For a long, long time, this made shipping bananas on any kind of scale a logistical nightmare. It was a race against decay, and for centuries, the banana always won. There was simply no reliable way to get this fruit from a tropical plantation to a port in New York or London before it turned into a pile of black, foul-smelling mush. And so, for most of the 19th century, the banana wasn't a food. It was a curiosity, a botanical spectacle. On the extremely rare occasion a ship captain managed to get a few bunches to port before they spoiled, they were treated with a kind of reverence that is honestly insane to think about today. These weren't a cheap snack you grab on the way out the door. We're talking about a luxury item for the absolute richest of the rich, sold individually, sometimes wrapped in tinfoil like a piece of priceless jewelry. At lavish Victorian dinner parties, a single banana might be unveiled as the centerpiece for dessert. And you didn't just peel it and eat it with your hands. That would have been considered barbaric. You were given a special plate, a knife, and a fork, and you were expected to slice it and eat it with the utmost delicacy. Can you even picture that? Eating a banana with a knife and a fork. It's completely wild, but it tells you everything you need to know. For Europeans and Americans, this wasn't produce. It was an exotic treasure, an edible exhibit from a faraway world. The banana was trapped in the tropics. Desirable, but essentially unshippable. To unleash it on the world, someone would have to do more than just build a company. They would have to solve an impossible puzzle. They would have to conquer time, speed, and biology itself. And it would take a few scrappy, incredibly ambitious American entrepreneurs to finally crack the code, and in doing so, build an empire more powerful and more violent than anyone could have ever imagined. So how do you solve a problem like rot? How do you break a biological clock that starts ticking the second a fruit leaves its tree? For decades, the answer was, you don't. You just try to outrun it. And this is where we meet the first of those scrappy American entrepreneurs, a man named Lorenzo Dow Baker, a tough New England sea captain who started making runs between Jamaica and the east coast of the United States. And his business model was, frankly, completely insane. He'd sail his fast schooner, the Telegraph, down to Jamaica, sell his cargo of textiles and cod, and then, just before heading home, he'd buy a few hundred bunches of green Gros Michel bananas. And then he'd just pray. Pray for good winds. Pray for no storms. Because his entire profit depended on shaving every last hour off the return journey. He had about 11 days before the fruit turned into a worthless, stinking mess. Sometimes he made it and got rich, sometimes he didn't, and he lost everything. It was a gamble, a high-stakes race against biology. But then, two things happened that would change the world. The first was steam. Steamships were faster, and more importantly, they were predictable. They didn't depend on the wind. They ran on a schedule. And that predictability was everything. But steam was only half the equation. The real magic, the technological leap that blew the whole game wide open, was refrigeration. And I don't mean packing the hold with blocks of ice and hoping for the best. That's what they tried at first, and it was a disaster. It was too cold, or not cold enough, or the ice would melt unevenly. It was still a gamble. No, the real catalyst was the invention of the mechanically refrigerated steamship, a ship that could create a perfectly controlled, constant chilled environment in its hold. This was the breakthrough. This wasn't just about making the bananas cold. It was about something much more profound. It was about putting them into a state of suspended animation. By holding the Gros Michel at a precise 57 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 13 degrees Celsius, you could literally hit the pause button on the entire ripening process. You could put the fruit to sleep in the tropics, and wake it up thousands of miles away, right at the doorstep of the American consumer. Suddenly the clock was broken. Time was no longer a factor. The race was over. And with that one technological solution, the business of bananas was completely transformed. It was no longer a frantic, high-risk gamble. It was a predictable, scalable, industrial process. You could harvest bananas by the ton, load them onto these new floating refrigerators, and ship them with near-perfect certainty to North American tables. This innovation is what turned green gold into actual, literal gold. And it was about to give Lorenzo Baker and his new business partner, Andrew Preston, the power to build an empire that would rewrite the map of Central America. All right, so the pieces are finally falling into place. You have the perfect fruit, the Gros Michel, and you now have the perfect technology, the refrigerated steamship, to put it into a deep sleep and ship it anywhere in the world. The race against time has been won. So what do you do with that kind of power? Well, Lorenzo Baker and Andrew Preston, the minds behind this technological revolution, knew exactly what to do. They needed to scale up, massively. And that meant they needed one thing they didn't have: land, and lots of it. But as it turned out, another American entrepreneur was already way ahead of them. His name was Minor C. Keith, and while Baker was conquering the sea, Keith was conquering the land. He'd been hired by the government of Costa Rica to build a national railroad from the capital, San Jose, to the Caribbean coast. It was a brutal, almost impossible project through dense jungle and treacherous mountains. Thousands of workers, mostly convicts and foreign laborers, died building it. But Keith had negotiated one hell of a deal. In exchange for building the railroad, the Costa Rican government gave him tax-free ownership of 800,000 acres of land along the tracks. And on that land, to give his railroad something to transport, he started planting bananas. And this is the moment the monster is born. In 1899, Baker and Preston's shipping company merged with Keith's massive land and railroad holdings. They called their new venture the United Fruit Company. And I need you to understand, this wasn't just a business. It was something entirely new, a private enterprise with the power, reach, and infrastructure of a developed nation. This company didn't just pay to use a country's infrastructure. It was the infrastructure. It built and owned thousands of miles of railroads that became the primary arteries of transport in half a dozen countries. It built and owned the telegraph and telephone lines that were the only form of modern communication. It dredged harbours, built whole port towns from scratch, and even ran the National Postal Service in places like Guatemala. And then there was the Navy. To move all those bananas, United Fruit built a massive fleet of custom, white-painted, refrigerated steamships. It was called the Great White Fleet, and at its peak, it was one of the largest private navies in the world, more powerful and more technologically advanced than the actual navies of the countries it operated in. This was a supranational entity, an empire unto itself, operating in Honduras, Guatemala, Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, and across the Caribbean. And in these places, which the writer O. Henry would famously dub banana republics, the company's power was absolute. It owned the farms, the roads, the rails, the ports, and very often the politicians. And when you have a corporation that is more powerful than the state itself, it stops asking for permission. It starts giving orders. And anyone who gets in the way is about to find out what happens when you try to stand up to a titan. Now, let's talk about that term from the end of the last section. Banana Republic. Today, we use it as a kind of generic, slightly racist insult for any small, unstable country with a corrupt government. But I need you to understand that when O. Henry coined that phrase, he wasn't being poetic. And he wasn't exaggerating, he was being literal. It wasn't a description of a dysfunctional government. It was the description of a business model. A very specific, very profitable, and fantastically brutal business model pioneered by men like Minor Keith and perfected by the most ruthless operator of them all, a man named Samuel Zemurray. Zemurray was a Russian immigrant who got his start in the banana game by buying the ripes, the slightly bruised, already yellowing bananas that United Fruit's refrigerated ships were throwing away at the docks in New Orleans. He was a hustler, a scrapper. He built his own company, the Cayamel Fruit Company, and by the early 20th century, he was ready to compete with the titan, United Fruit. And to do that, he needed land, a lot of it, for free. And this is where the business model kicks in. Honduras, at the time, was a very poor country, and it was deep in debt to American and British banks. So Zemmour went to the Honduran government with a simple, breathtakingly arrogant proposal. I will work with JP Morgan to pay off your entire national debt. In exchange, you will give me 25,000 acres of prime, tax-free land along the river, and you will guarantee that my company pays 0 taxes of any kind. For 25 years. The Honduran government, pressured by the United States, refused the deal. So Sam Zemmour overthrew their government. I am not making this up. He went to a bar in New Orleans, recruited a notorious mercenary named Lee Christmas, bought a surplus US Navy warship, loaded it with machine guns and a private army, and launched a coup. His forces installed a friendly ex-president who, as his very first act in office, signed the contracts, giving Zemmour everything he wanted. That is what a banana republic actually is. It's a country where a fruit company has more power than the state, a place where a private citizen can hire his own army, topple a sovereign government, and install a puppet in order to get a better deal on land exports. It's the ultimate hollowing out of a nation. Sovereignty itself becomes just another bargaining chip, traded away for a few thousand acres of banana trees. And of course, United Fruit was watching all this. And they learned the lesson. In neighboring Guatemala, they used the exact same playbook, pressuring the government into a deal that gave them nearly 500,000 acres of land, a 99-year tax exemption, and control of the nation's only port. For 50 years, the company and the Guatemalan government were essentially the same entity. This was the system. The machine built on the perfect, indestructible Gros Michel banana. Not just plantations and railroads and ships, but a geopolitical machine of private armies, corporate-sponsored coups, and puppet governments, all designed to ensure an endless supply of cheap yellow fruit for the breakfast tables of North America. So you've built the perfect system. You have puppet governments. You have private armies. Your power is absolute. But there's still one annoying little variable you can never completely control: the people who actually do the work. The thousands of men who spend their lives cutting down the banana bunches in the suffocating heat. And what happens when those people finally decide they've had enough? Which brings us to Colombia in the year 1928. On the massive United Fruit plantations near the Caribbean coast, the workers went on strike. And I want you to listen to their demands because it wasn't some radical communist manifesto. They wanted basic stuff. They wanted to be paid in actual money, not company store scrip. They wanted a 6-day work week instead of 7. They wanted basic sanitation and for the company to build toilets in their living quarters. And United Fruit's response? It was brilliant. And it was pure evil. They said the workers weren't their employees. You see, the company had set up a system of contractors and subcontractors, a web of middlemen designed for this exact situation. So legally, United Fruit had no workers to negotiate with. The strike was illegal. But the workers held their ground, so the company went to their friends in the Colombian government and the American embassy, and they didn't call the strikers workers. They called them subversives, communists, a threat to national stability. United Fruit sent a cable to Washington saying the country was in danger, that American interests were at risk. The government, under immense pressure, declared a state of siege in the banana zone. And then they sent in the army. On the night of December 6th, thousands of striking workers, along with their wives and children, were gathered in the main square of the town of Ciénaga. They were waiting to hear from the governor. Instead, the army surrounded the square and set up machine guns. A general gave them a 5-minute warning to disperse. The crowd, packed into the square, didn't move. The general counted down, and then the soldiers opened fire. They fired into a crowd of unarmed men, women, and children. The panic, the chaos was unimaginable. We don't know how many people died that night. We probably never will. The official government report, issued days later, said 47 civilians. Later, the US ambassador to Colombia would send a dispatch to the Secretary of State, estimating the number was over 1,000. The bodies, witnesses said, were loaded onto a train and dumped into the sea. And the story might have ended there, buried by a corrupt government and a powerful corporation. Except it didn't, because that massacre would be immortalized by a young boy whose grandfather was a veteran of Colombia's civil wars and who told him stories about what really happened that day. A boy named Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who would grow up to write 100 Years of Solitude, and in it tell the story of the 3,000 men, women and children shot dead in a town square and carted off on a silent corpse-filled train. This was the real business model. This was the dark heart of the banana republic. The machine wasn't just designed to keep prices low, it was designed to kill anyone who tried to raise them. This was the price of a cheap banana. So we've seen the company's business model: brute force, private armies, state-sponsored massacres. It was effective, but in the new, post-war world of the 1950s, it was also getting a little messy, a bit too obvious. As the world started paying more attention, United Fruit realized that the most powerful weapon wasn't the machine gun. It was the story. Which brings us back to Guatemala. In 1951, the country democratically elected a president named Jacobo Arbenz, and Arbenz had a simple popular idea: land reform. He passed a law allowing the government to buy unused land from massive plantations and redistribute it to impoverished, landless farmers. And guess who owned most of the unused land in Guatemala? United Fruit was furious. This wasn't just a financial hit. It was an existential threat to their entire business model, which relied on owning vast, fallow territories to keep competitors out and land values low. But arguing about property rights with a popular, democratically elected leader was a losing battle. It was a public relations problem. And for a problem that big, you don't just hire a PR firm. You hire the architect of modern reality itself. You hire a man named Edward Bernays. If you don't know that name, you absolutely should. Bernays was Sigmund Freud's nephew, and he used his uncle's theories about the subconscious mind not to cure people, but to control them. He was the father of public relations, a term he invented because propaganda had gotten a bad name after the Nazis. This is the man who convinced American women to start smoking by rebranding cigarettes as feminist torches of freedom. He was, put simply, a master at engineering consent. So, hired by United Fruit, Bernays launched what might be the single most brazen and successful disinformation campaign in corporate history. He didn't just write press releases. He waged a full-spectrum war on the truth. He set up a fake independent news service to funnel propaganda into the American media. He flew influential journalists down to Guatemala on all-expenses-paid junkets, where they were carefully guided and fed the company line. He showered congressmen with fact sheets and planted terrifying stories in the New York Times and Time magazine. And the story was always the same. Jacobo Arbenz wasn't a reformer trying to help his people. He was a dangerous communist agent, establishing a Soviet beachhead just a stone's throw from American soil. It was a masterpiece of deception, a complete fabrication. But in the paranoid heights of the Cold War, it worked. It worked perfectly. President Eisenhower, convinced of the communist threat, authorized the CIA to act. The agency, conveniently led by Alan Dulles, a man whose former law firm had United Fruit as a major client, launched Operation PB Success. They armed and trained a tiny rebel force, used their own planes to bomb Guatemala City, and within months, Arbenz was overthrown and forced into exile. The new military dictator immediately outlawed unions, rolled back every single reform, and, of course, returned all the land to United Fruit. It was the company's greatest triumph. They had perfected the machine. Why bother with expensive mercenaries and messy coups when, with the right story, You could get the most powerful government on earth to do your dirty work for you for free. Okay, so you've got the CIA overthrowing governments for you. You've got a master propagandist on the payroll, turning democratic reformers into communist boogeymen. That solves the messy political problems on the ground. But it creates another one back home, a public relations problem. Because even with a controlled media, stories of massacres and coups have a nasty habit of leaking out. And it doesn't look great when the fruit you're selling as a wholesome family snack is connected, however tangentially, to corporate-sponsored wars. You can't just control the narrative in Washington. You have to control the narrative in every kitchen in America. You have to make the banana itself so fun, so innocent, and so utterly disconnected from politics that any accusation of brutality seems ridiculous. So, how do you do that? How do you take a symbol of violent imperialism and launder it into something completely harmless? Well, you bury the truth under a mountain of kitsch. And the first shovel was wielded by a woman wearing a hat made of fruit. Her name was Carmen Miranda, the Brazilian bombshell. And she wasn't just a movie star. She was a walking, singing, technicolor piece of corporate and political branding. Promoted by Hollywood and the US government as part of the good neighbor policy, her entire image was designed to present a happy, vibrant, and, most importantly, completely non-threatening vision of Latin America. She was the human ambassador for the fantasy, the idea that these countries weren't places of exploitation and violence, but a giant musical paradise full of dancing and fruit, and United Fruit loved it. She was the perfect flamboyant distraction. But as effective as Carmen Miranda was, she was still a person. For their next trick, United Fruit would create something even more powerful. An icon that would become synonymous with the fruit itself. In 1944, they debuted a new mascot, a cartoon banana, dressed like a flamenco dancer who sang a catchy little calypso jingle. Her name was Chiquita, and the song she sang, "I'm Chiquita Banana and I've come to say," was a work of absolute genius. It was one of the most successful advertising jingles of all time. At its peak, it was played on the radio 376 times a day. It was an earworm, a public service announcement that taught Americans how to ripen and store their bananas, all wrapped in a fun tropical tune. It gave the banana a face, a name, and a friendly female personality. And this is the real masterstroke. This is the final gear clicking into place in the great machine of deception. You take all the bloodshed, all the coups, all the exploitation, and you plaster a sticker of a smiling, singing cartoon lady over it. Who could possibly believe that this friendly little banana was at the heart of an evil empire? It's psychologically brilliant. It's disarming. The image and the reality are so far apart, they can't possibly coexist in your mind. The violence of the Banana Republic was scrubbed clean, replaced by the harmless tropical fantasy of Chiquita and Carmen Miranda. They didn't just sell you the fruit, they sold you the story that let you eat it without asking any questions. And it worked. It worked perfectly. So let's just take a step back and appreciate the magnificent, horrifying machine that United Fruit had built by the middle of the 20th century. You've got puppet governments, a private navy, the CIA on speed dial, and the greatest propaganda artist of all time making sure the American public just keeps humming a catchy tune. It's a system of total control, an empire built not of land, but of a single fruit. But here's the thing, that entire, globe-spanning, blood-soaked empire, all the spies, all the ships, all the massacres, all the singing cartoon ladies, was built on one single, fragile biological foundation, the Gros Michel banana. And I need you to understand, this wasn't just some banana. We literally don't have this fruit anymore, but the people who remember it, they talk about it like a long-lost love. It was bigger than our modern banana. It had a thicker skin, so it was almost impossible to bruise. But the taste, oh, the taste. It was creamier, sweeter. It had an intense, powerful flavor that was almost floral. You know that artificial banana flavor you find in candy, like in a Laffy Taffy or a pack of Runts. That flavor isn't an exaggeration. That's what a real banana used to taste like. We made a chemical to copy it because the original is gone. And it's gone because there was a problem that no army could shoot and no PR firm could spin. A quiet, microscopic killer living in the dirt. Its name was Panama disease. This wasn't some pest you could spray away with chemicals. It was a fungus that lived in the soil, sometimes for decades. It would work its way up through the roots of a banana plant, clog its vascular system, and basically strangle it from the inside out. The leaves would turn a sickly yellow, wilt, and the whole plant would just collapse into a pile of rot. And because every single Gros Michel on the planet was a clone, they were all genetically identical. They had no defense. Zero. If the disease could kill one plant, it could kill every single plant on Earth. And once the soil was infected, it was infected forever. At first, United Fruit thought they could just outrun it. A plantation in Panama would get hit, so they'd just abandon tens of thousands of acres and move to Costa Rica or Honduras. But the fungus, hiding on a worker's boot or a piece of equipment, always followed. It was a biological rupture, a slow-motion apocalypse creeping through the soil from one country to the next. The company had built a perfect system to control politics and people, but they couldn't control biology. Their perfect, indestructible fruit, the very foundation of their power and wealth, was being systematically wiped off the face of the earth. And there was nothing they could do to stop it. So what do you do when your entire world-spanning empire is built on a single fruit that is actively dissolving beneath your feet? A fruit that is, quite literally, going extinct. Well, if you're United Fruit, the company that overthrew governments and ran its own private navy, you panic. For the first time, they were facing an enemy they couldn't bribe, intimidate, or assassinate. And so began one of the most desperate, frantic scrambles in the history of agriculture. The company sent its scientists fanning out across the globe, to every jungle, every remote island, every botanical garden they could find. Their mission: find a new banana. Anything. They brought back hundreds of varieties to their research station in Honduras, a kind of banana Area 51, and put them through the ringer. Could it be grown on a massive scale? Did it taste right? And most importantly, could it survive a 2-week journey in the refrigerated hold of a steamship? One after another, the candidates failed. Some were too small. Others had skin as thin as paper, turning to black mush the second they were packed in a crate. Many of them just tasted weird. It was a disaster. And then they found it, tucked away in their collection, a variety they had mostly ignored for years. It was an oddball that had been cultivated in the greenhouses of an English duke before being brought to the Caribbean. It was called the Cavendish, and by every measure, it was a terrible banana. It was smaller than the Gros Michel. Its skin was thin and delicate, bruising at the slightest touch. It had none of the rich, creamy, intense flavor that people knew and loved. It was, to be blunt, a bland, fragile, second-rate fruit, a total downgrade. But it had one thing going for it. One single, solitary virtue that made all its other flaws irrelevant. It was immune to Panama disease. And so, with no other options on the table, the decision was made. United Fruit, kicking and screaming, went all in on the Cavendish. They had to completely re-engineer their entire system. New boxes, new packing techniques, more careful handling at every single step of the process. It was a massive, expensive, infuriating pivot to a banana they knew was inferior. But it was either that or the entire global banana trade would simply cease to exist. The king was dead, and this clumsy, fragile, tasteless imposter was the only heir to the throne. Okay, so the king is dead. Long live the king. The banana industry was saved, but it was saved by a weak, fragile, second-rate pretender to the throne. The Cavendish was a public relations nightmare and a logistical disaster waiting to happen. That thin skin meant it bruised constantly. The entire system of packing, shipping, and handling that had been perfected for the tough, resilient Gros Michel was now completely useless. So how did this happen? How did this bland, delicate, fussy banana become the perfectly uniform, flawlessly yellow fruit that we see in every single grocery store on the planet? How did a banana that bruises when you look at it too hard end up being the most consistent piece of produce you can possibly buy? Well, if you can't make the fruit stronger, you have to make the system smarter. And the solution was a masterpiece of chemistry and control. Here's how it works. Bananas aren't picked when they're ripe. They're not even picked when they're close to being ripe. They are harvested when they are rock hard, deep green, and completely inedible. They're basically useless as food, but they're perfect for shipping. In this state, they're durable. They're then packed in special boxes, put onto those refrigerated ships, and held in that state of suspended animation at 57 degrees Fahrenheit for weeks at a time. They're put to sleep. But that was only half the solution. The real question was, how do you wake them up? And more importantly, how do you wake them all up at exactly the same time, right on schedule? The secret is a gas, ethylene. Now, ethylene is a natural plant hormone. It's the chemical signal that a fruit sends to itself to say, okay, it's time to ripen. It's what makes fruit get softer and sweeter. But United Fruit, now operating as Chiquita, and its competitors realized they could hijack this natural process. They could use it as a weapon of control. So today, when a shipment of green, sleeping bananas arrives at a distribution center in, say, New Jersey, they aren't just unloaded. They're put into massive, airtight, temperature-controlled warehouses called ripening rooms. And then, on a precise schedule, the pumps kick in, and those rooms are flooded with a synthetic ethylene gas. They are gassing the fruit to force it to ripen on command. And I want you to understand what this means. It means total, absolute, programmable control. A retailer can literally call the distribution center and place an order by color. They have a 7-point color chart, from deep green to yellow with brown flecks. A grocery store can say, I need 20 boxes of color number 3 by Tuesday, and another 15 boxes of color number 4 for the Friday shipment. And the ripening rooms make it happen. Perfectly. Every single time. It's not agriculture anymore. It's manufacturing. They took an inferior fruit, a biological failure, and built a system of such staggering logistical perfection around it that it didn't matter. They solved the problem of biology by simply taking biology out of the equation. So they did it. They solved the problem of biology by simply taking biology out of the equation. With a system of total, absolute, programmable control, they could turn a fragile, inferior fruit into the most dependable and consistent product on Earth. Problem solved forever, right? Of course not, because you can't actually take biology out of the equation. You can only delay it, you can only fight it, and that fight is constant, and it is brutal. Here's the thing. The Cavendish was celebrated because it was immune to the specific strain of Panama disease that wiped out the Gros Michel. But that's like celebrating a soldier for being bulletproof right before he walks into a minefield. It turns out, the Cavendish is fantastically susceptible to a whole swarm of other pests and blights. And one in particular is an absolute nightmare, a devastating leaf fungus called black sigatoka. And unlike the old Panama disease, which lived in the soil, black sigatoka spreads through the air, rotting the leaves of the banana plant until it can no longer photosynthesize, effectively starving it to death. So how do you fight a plague that comes from the sky? You wage a war from the sky, an endless, desperate chemical war. I want you to try and picture this. On these vast monoculture plantations, crop duster planes fly low over the fields, showering them with powerful, broad-spectrum fungicides. Not once a season, not once a month. We're talking up to 60 times a year, a weekly bath in a toxic cocktail, just to keep the plants alive. It's one of the most chemically intensive farming systems on the entire planet. And these chemicals don't just land on the banana leaves. They drift over the workers in the fields, who are often given little to no protective equipment. over the surrounding villages, the homes, the schools, the playgrounds. The toxic runoff poisons the rivers, sterilizes the soil, and decimates the local ecosystem. It's an ecological disaster zone hidden thousands of miles away, all to prop up a fundamentally broken fruit. It's the ultimate dark irony. To get that perfect yellow, natural banana onto your kitchen counter, the industry had to create a chemical hellscape, a system that poisons its own workers and land, all to keep a fragile clone on life support. But even this insane, non-stop chemical assault wasn't going to be enough. They were fighting one war in the air, but they were about to lose another one on the ground. Because while everyone was watching the skies for black sigatoka, an old ghost was quietly crawling back out of the soil, a brand new strain of Panama disease, and this one could kill the Cavendish. So, you've got a system of total chemical warfare propping up a fragile fruit, and a new biological apocalypse quietly gathering on the horizon. And you'd think that would be enough trouble for one industry. You'd think all the corporate energy would be focused on, not letting their only product go extinct again. But of course not. Because while one war was being fought in the soil, another one was about to break out in the halls of global power, and this one was over who got to sell the bananas in the first place. Here's the thing. By the 1990s, the world of trade was changing. The old rules were being replaced by a new global institution with real teeth, the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. And the newly formed European Union decided to use this new era to test out an idea. They wanted to give preferential treatment, lower tariffs, to bananas coming from their former colonies in Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. These were small, family-run farms, and the EU saw this as a way to support developing nations. A noble goal, right? Well, the American banana giants, Chiquita and Dole, didn't think it was so noble. In fact, they saw it as an act of war. Their entire business model was built on massive, industrial-scale plantations in Latin America, and these new EU rules were designed to favor their smaller competitors. It was a direct threat to their bottom line. And you can probably guess what happened next. Chiquita's CEO made a few phone calls, made a few very large political donations, and suddenly the United States government was arguing that Europe's attempt to help poor farmers was actually a dastardly violation of free trade. It's the same old playbook. When your business model is threatened, you wrap it in a flag and call it patriotism. And so began the great banana wars of the 1990s. I'm being completely serious. For almost a decade, the United States and the European Union were locked in one of the nastiest, most ridiculous trade disputes in modern history. The US took the case to the WTO and won. And when the EU dragged its feet on changing the rules, the US unleashed its revenge. But here's the crazy part. They didn't put a tariff on European cars or steel. No, the retaliation was surgically designed to be as petty and politically painful as possible. The US government drew up a list of seemingly random European luxury goods and slapped a 100% import tax on them. We're talking about things like Scottish cashmere sweaters, French handbags, pecorino cheese from Italy, Danish ham, Belgian waffles, all of it held hostage in a transatlantic stare-down, not over nuclear weapons or territorial disputes, but over who got to sell cheap bananas in a German supermarket. It was a geopolitical circus. It reshaped international trade law, and it proved, once and for all, that there was no line the banana companies, and the governments in their pocket, wouldn't cross to protect their fragile yellow empire. They had literally taken the world to the brink of a trade war over the Cavendish. But all the tariffs and all the lobbyists on Earth couldn't change one simple, terrifying fact. The ghost in the soil was still coming, and it was hungry. So you have governments fighting, you have the WTO getting involved, you have these massive, ridiculous trade wars, all for one single, slightly subpar banana. All this geopolitical madness, all this corporate maneuvering, just to protect the global supply of the Cavendish. And it's crazy, because I want you to remember something we said way back at the beginning of this whole thing. There are over 1,000 different kinds of bananas out there, and they're not just slight variations. We're talking about a completely different universe of fruit that the Western world has never seen. A hidden diversity that the global shipping container has no time for. There's the red Dhaka, a banana from Southeast Asia that's smaller and plumper than a Cavendish, with a beautiful reddish-purple skin. And when it ripens, the flesh is creamy and sweet, with a flavour that people swear tastes like raspberries. Or what about the blue Java? This is one that blows my mind. People call it the ice cream banana, and they're not exaggerating. The skin is a weird, powdery, silvery blue when it's young, and when it ripens, the flesh has the consistency of vanilla ice cream or custard, and it tastes like it too. Seriously, an all-natural banana that tastes like dessert. And then you get into the truly weird stuff. The fei bananas of the Pacific Islands. These things grow straight up towards the sky instead of hanging down. They're bright orange, both inside and out, and they're starchy and have to be cooked. They're a completely different branch of the banana family tree. So why have you never seen one of these in your local supermarket? Why are our fruit bowls so tragically boring? Well, the answer brings us right back to the cynical heart of this whole story. It's because they're not good products. The red Dhaka has a thinner skin. The blue Java is incredibly delicate and bruises almost instantly. The fei need to be cooked, so you can't just sell them as a grab-and-go snack. They can't survive the journey. They don't fit into the system. They can't be picked rock-hard green, gassed in a ripening room, and turned a perfect uniform colour on a predictable schedule. So they remain local treasures, secret fruits enjoyed by the communities that grow them, completely invisible to the massive global machine that only has room for one. We built this entire fragile empire on a single boring clone, while a whole world of incredible flavour and diversity was right there, just outside the frame. And now, as that old ghost from the soil starts to creep back, we're about to find out just how high a price we're going to pay for that choice. Alright, so what is the price we pay for betting our entire global food system on a single fragile clone, while ignoring 1,000 other options? What happens when that ghost in the soil, the one that ate the Gros Michel for breakfast, decides to come back for a second course? Well, that's not a hypothetical question, because it's here. It's been here for a while, quietly spreading in the dark, and now it's about to bring the whole system crashing down. Again. It has a name. It's called Panama Disease Tropical Race 4, or TR4 for short, and it is the single greatest threat the modern banana has ever faced, because unlike that first strain, the one the Cavendish was immune to, TR4 kills the Cavendish, kills it just as easily and just as completely as its predecessor killed the Gros Michel. It's the exact same fungus, just evolved. A new key for a new lock. It was happening all over again. The story starts in the early 1990s. The first outbreaks of TR4 were spotted in banana plantations in Taiwan and Malaysia. At first, the big companies weren't that worried. It was a local problem, thousands of miles from their massive Latin American operations. They figured they could contain it, build a biological firewall around Southeast Asia. But you can't build a wall against a microscopic fungus. Slowly, unstoppably, it began to spread. It moved on the sole of a worker's boot, on a contaminated piece of farm equipment. It crept through the soil from Indonesia to the Philippines, from China to Pakistan. And for 20 years the industry just watched, holding its breath, hoping the firewall would hold. And then, in 2013, the nightmare scenario happened. The fungus jumped. It was suddenly detected thousands of miles away, in Mozambique, and then in Lebanon, and then Israel. The containment had failed. The ghost was out. For a few more years, Latin America, the heartland of the global banana export trade, remained clean. It was the last sanctuary. The industry poured millions into biosecurity, desperately trying to keep the plague out. But everyone knew it wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when. And in the summer of 2019, the alarm bell finally rang. TR4 was officially confirmed in Colombia. The firewall was breached. The fungus was in the Americas. The slow-motion replay of the Gros Michel disaster had officially begun. So, the alarm bell is ringing. The ghost is in the Americas. The slow-motion replay of the Gros Michel disaster has officially begun. And an entire $10 billion a year industry is watching its only product actively go extinct. What do you do? Well, if you're the banana industry, you do exactly what you did last time. You panic and you scramble. Right now, as we speak, there is a frantic, desperate, worldwide search underway for a new banana, a replacement, a Cavendish 2.0. And the search is taking two very different paths. On one path, you have the brute force approach. Scientists are fanning out across the globe once again, just like they did in the 1950s, digging through botanical gardens and remote jungles, hoping to find another naturally occurring variety that just happens to be resistant to TR4 and can survive the brutal logistics of the global supply chain. And so far, that search has come up mostly empty. There are a few contenders, but none of them are perfect, and the industry doesn't do good enough. It does perfect. So that leads us to the other path. The 21st century solution. If you can't find the perfect banana, maybe you can build it. In labs in Australia and the Netherlands, scientists are going nuclear. They're using genetic modification, taking genes from other resistant banana species and splicing them directly into the Cavendish genome. And it works. They have created a GMO Cavendish that is completely immune to TR4. Others are using CRISPR, the gene editing tool, to try and tweak the Cavendish's own DNA to switch on its defenses. They are, quite literally, trying to hack the fruit to save it. They're fighting biology with a better kind of biology. And so the race is on. To find a new clone, to build a new clone, to find the one, single, perfect replacement that can be plugged right back into the exact same system of refrigerated ships, ripening rooms, and grocery store shelves. The whole world is holding its breath, waiting for the new king. But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the story isn't about finding the next perfect banana. Maybe the real lesson here is that we should stop looking for one. Because this whole story, this incredible, century-long epic of spies and scientists and massacres and singing cartoon ladies, it isn't really about a fruit. It's about an idea. The idea that we can take something wild and alive and force it to be a predictable, uniform, industrial product. The idea that we can conquer biology with logistics, that we can engineer nature itself to fit into a shipping container. We took a 1 in a billion genetic accident, a sterile mutant, and we built an empire on it. And when that empire collapsed, we just found another one and did it all over again. We built a machine designed to produce an endless supply of cheap, yellow, identical fruit. And for a while, it worked. But the ghost in the soil, both the old one and the new one, is the proof that the machine is built on a lie. Nature doesn't do monoculture. Biology doesn't do uniformity. Life is diverse and messy and unpredictable. And it will always, always find a way to break the systems we build to contain it. Sooner or later, the clock always runs out. So that banana on your counter, the one we talked about at the very beginning, it's not a fraud. It's a tragedy. It's the survivor of a previous extinction, living on borrowed time before the next one. It's the bland, fragile understudy that got the starring role only after the lead was killed off. It's the end result of a brutal system of conquest, exploitation, and chemical warfare, all hidden behind a happy cartoon sticker. It's a biological ghost that took over the planet, but only by sacrificing everything that made its 1,000 other cousins so interesting. And now, that ghost is about to vanish. Again. And maybe this time, instead of just searching for the next clone to plug into the same broken machine, we can remember that there's a whole world of red and blue and sweet and starchy and strange, incredible bananas out there. A world we've ignored because it wasn't perfect, because it wasn't a product. Maybe this time we can finally learn the lesson.